So welcome back. So as I said, we're going to be talking for the first part of class today. I'm not sure how long it's going to take, so I would like you guys to get comfortable. Grab a notebook if you like to take notes, or if you just want to listen, you can get comfortable, lay on the floor, flat on your back, or you can sit and listen to me. I do have one picture to show you, so I will let you know when I'm going to show you that. So, as you guys know, I just came back from Portugal and I jetted off to Portugal pretty spontaneously, as I like to do these days. But the reason why I did that was because I felt like it was very difficult to sit with myself in New York in my daily routine. I needed to change the scenery, right? I felt because when you change your environment, it sometimes gives you an opportunity to interact with yourself differently than you normally would. You cannot escape yourself. You're always going to be with yourself. You can't get out of your own skin. So the grass is not greener on the other side in terms of like thinking, oh, if I change my environment, I will change because I can escape whatever it is that I want to escape, because it's not possible. What a change of environment allows you to do is to interact with yourself differently, because you're in a new place with new stimuli, meeting new people, etc. Yeah, so that's, for those of you who are thinking like, should I go somewhere? I have never regretted anywhere that I have gone to, even if it was last minute, even if it was expensive. I always have a little bit of fear and trepidation. It's not like I'm inhuman. I do get nervous, especially this trip. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm staying. So I definitely have a little bit of that. And part of me is like, maybe I should just stay home in New York. But I do push myself and encourage myself to get out. And I never have ever regretted it. So I keep thinking to myself, well, if I didn't regret it in the past, why would I regret it now, right? So anyway, it was a very good experience. And the whole trip, the theme, I realized underlying it all was this idea of self-love and self-grace. Now, love is obviously overarching. It's a lot about acceptance. It's a lot about feeling your value and self-respect. Grace, I like to put them together because I think grace harbors a grace, like this person is very graceful, they move really gracefully. Like this word grace and how the body is very interrelated, right? And it also has this component of being able to forgive and accept yourself, and that allows you on both a psychological and a physical level to be graceful. So I like to include that as well. But this is the topic for the next period. I don't know how long the period is going to last. I think this period is going to last a while, to be honest. The biomechanics of self-love and self-grace. Okay. The reason why I wanted to start this period with a conversation is because I think it's very difficult to love ourselves in today's world. And there's a lot of pretending to love oneself going on, which isn't with bad intention at all, right? But I think that people don't understand where the crux of self-love and self-grace comes from on a psychological level and physical level. And so they do a lot of things, right? Like wellness is a big trend. It has been for a while now. Self-care is a big trend that's been for a while, right? But then there's all these ironies about how, like, there's these articles online written about how self-care and wellness are for the rich, and like, I mean, there's just it's just kind of ironic. It's like I sometimes look up like these medical retreats, wellness medical retreats, and the prices is like insane. And then you go there for 1 week, all the celebrities do it, and like the influencers. And you like eat vegan for 1 week and you meditate, and then you get like smoothies, and they have a yoga class next to the beach, and you pay like thousands of dollars to self-love. And what does that really do? Is there a long-lasting result? Most of the time, no. And I even found myself oftentimes trying to self-love as opposed to actually experiencing it, trying to self-love, getting an acai bowl, going to get a massage, doing my skincare routine, taking myself on a vacation, buying nice things. These are all genuine, intentional efforts, and oftentimes they do have a little bit of an effect. It's not like they're useless, right? But it's not the crux. It is not the crux. It is the icing on the cake, so to speak. It's important because then your cake is beautiful and delicious, but it is not the crux. It's not the meat of the cake. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. And I thought, you know what, I might as well use my personal example because it's easy to sort of like just blah, blah, blah. And you might as well check out like a self-help book on psychology, and then you'll like hear the same things. But when I talk about it for myself, especially because many of you have followed me for a long time and you know more or less like a lot about me, right? It probably will be more impactful if I use personal examples. And I think that's most important, like most interesting too, because when you storytell, it's always better than when you sort of like instruct, right? So I'm going to just share a little bit more with personal examples so you guys can understand these concepts I'm about to speak about. So many of you might have heard of this idea of shadow psychology, like the shadow. Some people call it the inner child. We all have one because we were all children at one point, right? And the inner child exists within all of us and it never leaves us. That's why it's called a shadow. It follows us around everywhere through thick and thin, good and bad, ups and downs in life. And what you need to understand is that the unfulfilled needs and desires of this inner child from real life when you were a child it's the foundation of our dysfunctional behavior as adults. This is not a new concept. It's been around for ages, but I want to talk about it because it's part of the self-love. So when I say dysfunctional behavior as adults, especially in our intimate relationships, but also just in general, in all relationships, right? There are patterns of behavior that are very difficult to break. We tend to repeat these patterns, that's why they're called patterns, over and over again in any situation, no matter who we are with, which job we have, where we live in the world. It's very difficult to break these patterns unless you learn how to recognize, embrace, forgive, and love your shadow, your inner child. That's the crux of self-love as an adult. It's about loving yourself, but everything is about nuance, right? Especially in biomechanics. The nuance is it's not just about loving yourself. It's actually about embracing which part of yourself? The shadow part of yourself, the inner child. So the first thing that needs to happen is that you need to recognize your inner child. What does your shadow look like? If you were to imagine him or her, what would she look like? And now I'm going to show you like what my inner child looks like, which I have done, I think, many, many, many months ago. At one point when we were speaking a little bit about self-grace, I think I showed you guys this picture. That's her. That's my shadow. Little Jess, I call her. She was in this picture, I think 11, and she's sitting at the piano. And the reason why that is my shadow is because that was a very representative image of the struggles that I faced when I was a child, meaning that, you know, my parents had high hopes for me. That's why they bought a Yamaha grand piano when I was 4 years old, even though they had like barely any money, and put me on that piano bench for 2 hours a day until I was like 14 years old, and paid however much money for my piano lessons, took me to all these piano competitions and recitals. Yeah. But I'll tell you guys a story. When I was like 10 or 11, I had a piano recital, and it was, you know, all my teachers, like top students, would go there with their families, and we would do a huge recital, right? I was supposed to play this piece. It was a pretty high level piece. However, I didn't really practice enough. I thought I was good. I didn't really practice enough. And when I got to the piano recitals piano, it was a different weighted key. Like the weight of the keys was different from mine at home. And so I played a little bit, and then I got stuck on like the first line. So I restarted, played again, got stuck on the same place. Restarted again, played, stuck on the same place. Now, at that point, I was like, okay, this is not happening. Mortified, of course I was, I'm sure. Can't remember exactly, but I think I was. And then I played a lower level piece. It was a piece that I learned when I was much younger, and some of the kids in the recital actually played that, the younger kids. I played that piece, finished, stood up, took a bow. People still applauded, but my dad, who had taken me to that recital, he motioned for me to leave, and he walked out of that room so fast that I had to chase after him, because he was very ashamed that I had made a mistake during my performance. And, you know, everybody was there, all the families, all the top kids of my teacher. And he felt shame. And he left, and I followed along. And this was this was just one example out of hundreds of thousands of examples of when I felt like my parents' pride in me, love, support, affection was dependent upon me managing a perfect performance. I needed to perform to show that I was good and to be without mistakes. And so I developed a fear of making mistakes, because that little girl, right, she struggled to feel special and loved and important if she made a mistake. And as an adult, I'm a perfectionist. I was a control freak, much more than I am now. I'm afraid of making mistakes, right? I'm afraid of failure. I need to perform. I need to show. I can't just do it. I need to show it to others and get external affirmation, right? And what happens as adults is that we develop defense mechanisms to deal with our fears. Those defense mechanisms become our dysfunctional behavior that affect our relationships with other people. My defense mechanism became arrogance. So I became very arrogant on the outside. Like, I'm the best. I can't be wrong. I'm always right. I don't need anybody. Nobody's as good as me. And in a way, that helped me achieve a lot, but it also went back into this arrogance thing. The more I achieved and was perfect, the more arrogant I became. And what does arrogance do? It fosters disconnect between you and other people, because people think that they're not as good as you. They always feel that you're better than them. So it was hard for me to maintain friendships. That's why I became more introverted. So I just didn't have opportunities to socialize, because as soon as I did, people thought that I was little Miss Perfect, little Miss Know-It-All. It was hard for me to be vulnerable with people because I couldn't make mistakes. So I couldn't really open myself up to other people, right? And even now as an adult, the face that I put on in to the world is always, I've got everything figured out. I'm very tough. And I was very arrogant, right? And that affects your personal relationships. So as you can see, what I'm explaining right now is that the unfulfilled needs and desires of the little girl, little Jess, created a fear that fostered a self-defense mechanism as an adult that negatively affects all my relationships. And it prevents me from finding someone and having a long-term relationship, maintaining friendships, and even being a good coach, the best coach that I could be to you guys. Anyway, with that being said, what is the solution, right? So once you recognize your shadow, that's step number one. Step number two is that you need to foster a good relationship with your shadow. So you know how self-love is all about, people are saying, oh, you have to have a good relationship with yourself. You have to build a better relationship with yourself. So the nuance is you actually need to build a better relationship with your shadow. So sometimes when I feel these negative emotions that come because my shadow is present, right? Like anxiety or fear or desperation or loneliness, or, you know, like, I mean, the biggest fears I have now are sort of related to, am I going to find a new partner, right? Because why am I not fine and perfectly fulfilled dancing in my living room? Because there's nobody to show it to. There's no performance aspect. There's no showing off ability. That's why I need a partner, because I need to compete, right? But of course, I like to compete, but there's also a need there based on fear because of my inner child. So, for example, when I feel like, oh my God, I'm never going to find a partner, I'm already getting older, like, am I going to compete again? When I feel that fear, when you feel any kind of negative emotion, you need to, instead of ignoring your inner child, I imagine sitting next to little Jess on this piano bench in this picture and speaking to her in a loving way. You're good, no matter if you have a perfect performance or not. You are important and you are special, no matter if someone sees you or not. It's okay to make mistakes. You don't have to be perfectly performing to the world all the time. So I talk to her in this loving way, in my imagination, in my mind, and immediately those negative emotions disappear. Most people can recognize their little shadow, but what you don't understand is that this shadow, what most people don't understand is that this shadow is going to be there forever. So it's a daily work that you have to do whenever the shadow pops up, that you take a moment to spend time with your shadow and talk to your shadow in a loving way, to train yourself to speak in a loving way to your shadow. Whenever she pops up or he pops up is a skill, and it has to be worked on, just like our psoas or our heart region. And that is how you develop self-love, because you are going to be living together with your shadow every day for the rest of your life. That's what it means to live with yourself for the rest of your life. So you have to have a good relationship with your shadow. You have to have a good relationship with yourself. That's the crux of self-love. And then when you go out and you eat an ice cream, you get a massage, take yourself on a vacation, buy yourself a bag, whatever, that is on top. That's because you have a great relationship with your shadow. That your shadow knows that she or he is loved and embraced and forgiven. It's not my fault that it's not little Jess's fault. None of it is her fault. She did the best she could. My parents did the best they could, but they operate based on their own fears and insecurities, right? They're the way they are because of their parents. So it's not little Jess's fault. And that's part of when you forgive, when your shadow feels forgiven and embraced, so will you. So back to this training, this exercising, right? What I just spoke about is a psychological component, but it's very important because we have mind and we have body. And I've always said from the beginning that when you approach it from the mental and when you approach it from the physical, you will progress and evolve way faster. So that's why I had this conversation with you. And that's why I also want you guys to, my homework, I guess, for you before Monday is I want you guys to take a moment and find what is your shadow. Try to recognize, what does your shadow look like? What does little, Emerald look like? What does little Victoria look like? What does little Amy look like? Right? And so what I did when I came back from Portugal is I printed out a picture of little Jess. I have her taped to my desk because I spend most of my time there. And I wrote her a little letter. I just wrote her like a little letter that basically, as I told you, I said, the basic gist is, dear little Jess, you are special, important, and loved no matter what mistakes you make. It's okay not to be perfect and not to perform all the time. Something along those lines. Like, how would you talk to your shadow is what you would write here. So that when you have those feelings, right, when your shadow becomes present and starts to like take over your life and you don't know why you're behaving the way you're behaving, take a look at that picture that you have of the little you and what you wrote and repeat that until you feel like you can do it in the middle of the street in Times Square when you're like rushing to work or like whatever, any time of the day. Does that make sense? It's a mental exercise that is just as in need of training and practice as physical exercises. So that's what I have sort of as a, like, this is important stuff. Like what we're going to do in the next few weeks, when I have flexibility on Tuesday, because there are a lot of people who are in flexibility that are not signed up for full body, I will have almost the same conversation again. So if you're in flexibility too, on Tuesday, I will repeat this. And it's important to hear it sometimes over and over again. I may include other details, other examples, because, I don't have a script. But so it might be nice to come and listen to that again. And maybe by then you will have figured out what your little shadow looks like, right? But yeah, like I said, mind and body together are very important to combine and address. And when it comes to the biomechanics of, okay, let me explain a little bit more about this mind body. So obviously I teach biomechanics, so we're going to work on the body. But the issue is that if you don't address the shadow, the mind and body can sometimes be counterproductive towards each other. So it means that, like, for instance, I get you to open up your heart, right? Let's say we open up the rib cage, which we're going to do a little bit today in a second. But then the next morning, little Jess pops up and she closes back your rib cage again because you feel fear and anxiety and desperation and sadness. And then you have to open up your rib cage. And then little Jess closes it again. And you open up your rib cage and over. So it's like fighting, right? So it's not very efficient. Let's put it that way. Oh my goodness, the sirens are going crazy. By the way, this is really random, but when I went to Lisbon, I thought I was going deaf. I thought I was losing my hearing because I had this ringing in my ears that I never had before in my life. And then I read online that it's because if you live in a very loud place your brain and your ears, they get used to that level of noise. So when you go to a quiet place, your brain is still like working and it produces sound. I thought I was going deaf. I was like, am I really like, but I think it's because I live in the middle of Times Square now. Every night, every day, I'm at home listening to like all this noise. Anyways, so yeah, does that make sense? The mind and body, if they're constantly fighting against each other and eliminating each other's like progress, it's the same thing like why therapy itself doesn't work, in my opinion, by itself, because little Jess is going to feel good, and then you're gonna do something at the gym and like close up your rib cage, and then you're gonna feel bad again. So anyways, all right, we're actually gonna start this exercise of possibly opening up the rib cage, but at the same time envisioning the shadow, your personal shadow. I'm going to have you lay on the ground now, on your back, if you're not already, on the mat. I'm just going to give you a few cues to open up your rib cage, and then we're going to spend literally the rest of the time quietly in your mind envisioning your shadow. What does little you look like? Does that make sense? And when I say like, what does little you look like? What representative of potentially the unfulfilled desires and needs that you had as a kid? So let's start on the floor first. And let's just talk about the heart for like a minute. So you're gonna really relax, okay? And even if I don't give you any cues, when you lay on the floor like this and close your eyes for a while, your heart will open. And the reason is because the ground creates this safety for your body that allows for tightness in different areas of the body to release. So we are going to just feel how the pressure of the floor works to change the way our rib cage feels. And we're going to be quiet for the next 10 minutes until the end of class. And you're going to take a little bit of time. You can open your eyes, close your eyes. It doesn't really matter to me, but take some time to envision your shadow. What does your shadow look like? It's not easy to envision your shadow, by the way. To figure out what is exactly that this unfulfilled need or desire that you had when you were little. Because we were little, we didn't know. I didn't know that the way my father reacted would make me feel like I wasn't loved and important unless I was perfect. I didn't know on a cognitive level. And so that's what, now as an adult, you are so much more intelligent and equipped to be able to figure it out. Try to take deep breaths. Don't hold any tension in the body as you're exploring your mind. Allow everything just to fall to the ground. What would you say to your shadow if you met her or him? How would you speak to her or him? What's the tone of voice you would use? What would you say? Feel how your ribcage slowly releases any tension. The heart relaxes inside of the ribcage and spreads. Sometimes, in order to find your shadow, it helps to try to remember, like, for instance, that moment at the piano recital. It was a very traumatic moment in my young childhood. Sometimes those moments stick out in your memory, and those are worth exploring because they tell you something about your experience. There's a reason why that moment was traumatic. You know that lower level piece? I can still play it to this day, the piece that I played at a recital. I can go on any piano and play it perfectly. There's a reason why that's the only piece that I remember how to play by memory. It's been 20 years. We're going to be here for 1 more minute, and then I have a few words for you before we finish. Alrighty, you guys can relax, sit up. That was not too much time. If, you struggle to recognize your shadow, that's totally normal. It is hard because you have to shift back through your childhood memories. And that's not a place where not all of us want to go back to, right? But one thing I will say is that I'm here to help any of you if you would like to reach out to me to help sort of figure out what is your shadow, what does it look like? I do that. I help people with that. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier is that oftentimes we will tend to try to rewrite the painful memories of our childhood in our intimate relationships. So that's why a lot of people have great friendships, but problematic romantic relationships, because we only do that with our romantic relationships because they most closely mirror the relationships that we had with our caregivers. And we will tend to try to rewrite history in those relationships, which is where a lot of problems start. This is also why, like, I've always been attracted to men who are very similar to my father, very honest, simple, kind men. And also why, I had issues in my romantic relationships, including the last one, because I was trying to basically prove the entire relationship that no matter how arrogant I was still loved, right? So I would test and push the limits. And that was because my inner child's unfulfilled need was to feel loved no matter how many mistakes she made, right? So when you recognize these things about yourself and you embrace your inner child, then you will be able to feel like you can truly move on with yourself from anything that is difficult to move on from. Because it's hard to move on from my last relationship because I felt like I was responsible, or if it was my fault, things like that, right? And we often feel that way, like, why did I lose my relationship? Why did I lose my job? Why am I not making, like, friends? Whatever it is, it's hard to move on from certain things. In order to move on from those things, you have to forgive yourself. But who are you forgiving? Who is actually being forgived? Who's doing the forgiving? You have to forgive your inner child. Your inner child has to feel like it's not their fault, because it's the dysfunctional behavioral pattern that arose from that caused you to lose whatever it is that you cared about, right? And so as long as you are able to recognize where this dysfunctional behavioral pattern comes from and address it, deep down, things will get better. You'll be able to be at peace. So when you find your inner child and you talk with her or him, you will feel physically a warmth, a calmness, a flow in your body. And the stuff that we're going to do, like that we're doing today, we're going to do this again. Like, even if full body only for the next 2 weeks becomes like laying on the ground and getting in touch, body and soul and mind, with our shadow, it will be invaluable. And remember that it's how you interact with your shadow on a daily basis, when it's important to interact with him or her, that determines everything. So it is work. It's not going to be like, oh, I did this, check, done, I should be perfect for the rest of my life. No, your shadow is going to be there coming up over and over again for the rest of your life. And people who have had really traumatic childhoods, and mine was not like traumatic like, you know, some people's, they have a really hard time throughout life, right? You know this, these are stories all the time in the news and stuff of people who had like a lot of abuse as children or whatever, and then as adults they can't function easily at all. So we can't escape our past. It's always going to be there. I feel very grateful that my childhood was mostly great, but it doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that there's no dysfunctional patterns as an adult. And I consider myself a pretty functional adult. And yet, right, now that you've heard my personal stuff. So I hope that this was helpful, and I hope that it creates some curiosity in you about yourself. And remember, before Monday, I'd like you to spend some more time in a safe place, like what we were doing now, on the floor, because that creates a physical sense of safety. I'd like you to think a little bit about your shadow, okay? I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a really great rest of your weekend. Bye, guys.